reached as high as the lizard's ankles. It climbed up to street level and stood hunched over, in a menacing, prowling posture as the huge feet came plodding softly down the street in my direction. High above, in the murky light that cut through the rainstorm, I could see the head swinging back and forth near the tops of the buildings. Tall, armored plates ran down the creature's back, similar to the protective spikes on the back of an ancient stegosaurus, only larger, much larger. I estimated the creature to be 90 feet wide at the haunches and just over 180 feet tall. Stretched head to tail, he would have been more than half the size of a football field. Among land animals, he appeared most closely related to a crocodile. It had an elongated, thickly muscled neck that led to a rather flat skull with an extremely powerful jaw. His rounded shoulders and long arms were abnormally well developed. He kept these arms folded, tucked tight against his chest, allowing his long clawed fingers, which never stopped moving, to dangle in front of him. Their constant twitching movements gave him a grasping, greedy appearance and generally contributed to his overall frightfulness. Perhaps the most surprising thing I noted was his physical grace. Instead of stomping down the street, he came stealing up closer to the square with silent, graceful steps. The ground was not shaking this time, but his tremendous weight compacted the asphalt and left a visible trail behind him. He crept up to the end of the block and peered carefully into the square. He was almost directly above me now, his great meaty belly 60 feet off the ground and blotting out the sky. He paused at the threshold of the square, hesitant, evaluating the danger. My mind was racing with questions about this strangely deformed and mutated creature, which I felt must have been the result of exposure to gene-warpingly high levels of atomic fallout. Its body seemed to be a hodgepodge of parts from other animals. I desperately wanted more opportunity to study it before it was killed. But as it sniffed loudly at the bait, I realized my time was short. This awesome new species was about to be blown away into extinction. In my frustration, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my camera. Determined to record the moment in some small way, I pointed and clicked. To my surprise, the camera's built-in flash lit up the entire block and immediately attracted the creature's attention. Like an enormous whip, the broad neck rolled down to street level, carrying the flattened horn-scaled head with it. The creature had a pronounced, almost noble chin which swept by just over my head like a floating semi-truck until it spotted me. I found myself being scrutinized by a 3-foot-tall eyeball which sparkled the color of liquid honey. It stared down at me only a few feet above, and blinked in 2 directions at once. In addition to the main eyelid's thick sheet of rough flesh, there was a gristly white nictitating membrane which closed from the sides. The loose, spiky skin on the underside of the throat scraped against the ground, and a soft, guttural purring came from deep within the throat. In order to sniff at me, the animal repositioned its head and turned one of its slit-like nostrils toward me. The glistening nostril was approximately 4 feet across and lined by pillows of calloused flesh. The warm air pouring in and out of its lungs swept across my face. I almost lost my self-control when I saw the lips begin to part. Lizards, I knew, used their tongues to help them smell, but I was afraid a long forked tongue was about to shoot out and wrap me up as a before-dinner snack. I was careful to keep as much of the asphalt boulder as possible between me and the jagged yellow teeth poking out from behind those thin, fleshless lips. I glanced behind me, thinking I might try to make a run for it, and saw a handful of soldiers pointing bazookas in my direction. If they fired at the creature, I was going to be caught in the middle. For some reason, this idea scared me more than the prospect of being devoured by the megalithic lizard looming over my shoulder. Gently, very gently, I raised my hands and signaled to the men to hold their fire. that everything was fine, nothing to be alarmed about. I eased away from the safety of my boulder and moved closer to the giant's snout. My head was only a few inches from one of his teeth, which was twice the size of a rhino's horn. "Good boy. That's a good lizard," I said. "Now go eat the fish." I tried to communicate the idea that I wasn't a threat, and it worked. With a slight grunting noise, the head lifted away toward the building tops, and one of his feet sailed almost directly over me. Still moving carefully, he stepped into the open square and began making his way toward the brightly illuminated pile of fish. I ran as fast as I could back to the communications post, jumped over the barricade of sandbags, and collapsed breathlessly into a chair. It was out in the open now, its underside brushing the treetops of Madison Square Park and moving away from us toward the Flatiron Building. He kept his hind end high off the ground, tail held straight back for balance, and took small, deliberate steps. Over the radio I heard Sergeant O'Neill's stunned words. "We need bigger guns." Just before it reached the food, the animal stopped one final time to make an inspection of the area. Its broad neck was just flexible enough to allow for a 360-degree scan of the surrounding buildings. There's no doubt that it recognized our presence in the square and the potential threat we represented. But the smell of the fish proved too tempting, and with a last sudden step, the beast stabbed his mouth forward and began to dig in. The enormous jaws unhinged and plunged into the pyramid of fish like a steam shovel, scooping up thousands of them in a single bite. Colonel Hicks, following the action on his video display across the river, immediately sounded the order. His voice boomed over all the hundreds of radios at once. "Fire at will! Fire at will!" O'Neill repeated. And a split second later, Flatiron Square erupted like a powder keg. From every angle, machine guns roared, and rocket launchers roared. Rapid bursts of flame spit from 1,000 gun muzzles, lighting up the sky, and the quiet night was ripped apart by the staccato hailstorm of projectiles, all flashing through the air toward the colossal reptilian body in the center. Hundreds of thousands of rounds were fired in the space of a few seconds, and presumably all of them found their target. Welling up out of the roar of gunfire came an even louder noise. A thunderous, ear-splitting animal wail. But we realized that it was only a screech of annoyance. The long tail and forearms began to flash through the air, swatting at the flying ammunition as if it were a bothersome swarm of mosquitoes. "Fire the sidewinders!" Hicks ordered. "Fire the sidewinders!" O'Neill said, relaying the orders. A large truck, hidden among the trees in the park, raised its multi-cannon firing mechanism and sent a trio of 6-foot-long missiles screaming toward the creature. He ducked out of their path with a lightning-fast reflex action, and they sailed past him, smashing into the venerable old Flatiron Building, demolishing it instantly. Over the radio we could hear Colonel Hicks screaming for more firepower, and behind him, Mayor Ebert, roaring in pain over the loss of the historic building. Highly agitated now, the lizard's tail began to thrash ever more violently from side to side. First he flew through the park, snapping trees off their trunks, then swung the other way and ripped apart the facades of the buildings facing the square. After another deafening roar, he turned and began to walk straight toward us. The great head lowered until it was just above street level and turned to one side so it could stare at us with one of those honey lustrous eyes. There was no doubt he was coming toward the communications post, and he was angry. "Let's get out of here!" Mendel yelled. He broke into a dead run down the sidewalk, heading for the nearest corner. After a split second of indecision, we all decided he had the right idea and took off in several directions at once. I bolted out into the open, planning on cutting across the nearest corner of the park to a set of buildings. Only then did I realize something important about the geography of Flatiron Square. There is absolutely no place to hide. And the titanic lizard coming up behind me was moving much faster than I had anticipated. Luckily, there was a life-size bronze statue of one of America's founding fathers, the great James Madison. I ducked behind the tall cube of granite on which President Madison stood and hoped the monster wouldn't step on me. As we had feared, he moved directly to the communications post, probably attracted by the lights on the instrument panels and the squawking of the radios. He swiped at it with one of his muscular forepaws, sending everything flying through the air with such force that the whole mess smashed into the third story of a building half a block away. As I cowered at the base of the statue, a division of tanks rolled up and swung their turrets around, training them on the enraged beast. Realizing I was directly in the line of fire, I scampered around to the far side of the statue. But this put me in plain sight of the lizard who charged in my direction. In a blind panic, I looked around for an escape route, but it was too late. With astonishing speed, the huge body rushed past me on a collision course with the tanks.
Godzilla.
As they fired,
Godzilla.
the monster leapt into the air and jumped directly over them.
Godzilla.
At the same time, the tip of his tail spanked the statue of President Madison hard
there.
across the backside.
Maybe,
The
like I
mortar
said,
shell
maybe
shot past me overhead
one
and
of
plowed into the
maybe
front of a
tomorrow or
building.
so, maybe we can bring
As
some
I
of
followed
those
their
horror
trajectory
DVDs
across
in.
the sky,
Yeah.
I noticed the heavy statue above me
Thank
teetering
you,
off
and
its
then
base,
Well, you could do
about
that
to
too
fall on me.
tomorrow too.
I tried to
Yeah,
run, but my
that's what
feet
I'm
slipped
doing.
out from under me on
champion.
the rain-slicked pavement, and I belly flopped to the ground.
I don't want to see the
A
other
second
one.
later, the statue
That thing
crashed to
don't
the
do
ground, and
nothing for me
President
because
Madison's head
I
was
don't like the
resting
way
on
it's
my
laid
chest.
out.
His outstretched arms had punctured the asphalt on either
Becker
side
has
of me.
one.
I was pinned to
That's
the
better.
ground, but lucky to be alive. Craning my neck to the side,
Yeah.
I caught a glimpse of the powerful beast galloping away up 6th Avenue
Powerful
on
beast.
all fours, moving with the grace of an overweight gazelle. Nick, are you all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine, I said.
Yeah, that's
Look.
nicer.
Sergeant O'Neill
I like
and
the
a
way
few of
the
his men
door
hoisted
is
the
back here,
statue
not
high
in front
enough off
like
the
that.
ground for
It's
me to
back.
shimmy my way out to freedom.
Coming in.
All of us were pretty stunned by what had happened.
I don't like where the
For a minute,
washer and
we
dryer
stood
sits
around
right
surveying
here.
the scene.
That's out of the way.
It was a
Yeah.
mess. The street was torn up, and half the buildings in the square were either decimated or
The only
badly
thing is, I
damaged.
want to make the
The
bathroom
historic
bigger. I would make
Flatiron
that
building was a
bathroom way
total
bigger.
loss,
That's why I want to go out.
and there was still a huge amount of
Go
fish
buy
lying
a
in the street.
60 or
I noticed
55,
something on the ground.
10 feet more
It was a puddle,
long.
but didn't look like rainwater. I knelt down and dipped my fingers into it. To my surprise, it smelled and tasted like blood.
What?
I found a glass sample tube and scooped up some of the viscous red-brown liquid.
Yeah.
When we got back to New Jersey, a nearby building caught my eye. It was a 24-hour pharmacy, one of those oft-overlooked miracles of convenience.
Where's that mailman?
I reached into my pocket and began twirling the beaker of blood I'd collected between my fingers. A bell over the door tinkled as I stepped into the pharmacy. The place seemed deserted. Hello? I rang the bell on the counter a couple of times before a woman in a wrinkled smock shuffled out from the back room. Can I help you, young man? Yes, I need a home pregnancy test.
What?
I'm looking for one that tests for gonadotropic hormones. But if you don't have any,
Master bedroom,
one of the
10
clomiphene
by
citrate
9,
kits will do
11.
the trick. She laid one package after another on the counter. I heard the bell tinkle on the door as another customer entered the shop. Without reading the labels, I reached for my wallet. I'll take them all, one of each. As the pharmacist was accepting my money, I heard a woman's voice from over my shoulder. You must have some harem. I recognized the voice and froze stiff for a moment before turning around to see who it was. She wore a long raincoat over a red dress. She was dripping wet.
I'd like to know what that
even
is.
more darling than I remember.
Like I said,
The sight of her
because
sent
they
a
would
quick arrow
only
shot
let
pain
me click
shooting
on
through
the
my
thing
chest.
to
Yeah, I know.
Is that you? Wow, hi, hello. It's good to see you, Nick.
See?
Yeah, they'll
Yeah.
let you do it.
The
Yeah.
pharmacist poured a few coins into my palm and handed me my bag full of test kits.
I'm just wondering.
Something was different about Audrey. She
These
seemed more
glasses, I'll
determined,
tell you, I can't
more
give 2
direct than I
cents for.
remembered her. I assumed it was the result of her success in her new career. She had an official press badge and everything. So, you made it. What? She looked confused, so I pointed to the photo ID she was wearing on her trench coat. You're a reporter. That's what you always wanted to be, right? I'm happy for you, really, I am. Yeah, well.
Okay.
She didn't seem quite convinced, but at the time I thought she was just being modest. We stepped
Okay,
outside
buddy,
and
go
stood
ahead,
under
do
the
your thing.
overhang of the
Yeah.
drugstore's doorway,
Okay.
keeping
Just
out of the
looking,
rain.
Just looking.
And you? Are you still picking apart cockroaches? That was a hell of a way to say hello after 8 years. I'm into earthworms now, I answered testily. But I don't want to bore you with my work.
Go ahead.
I know invertebrate biology isn't exactly your bag.
He's after me.
My tone of voice must have betrayed some of my bitterness. You're still mad at me. Well, yes, I admitted. You left without so much as a phone call, no letter, no nothing. That was 8 years ago, Mick. She made it sound like an eternity. Some people change, you know. Most people don't, I said bluntly. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. She turned up her collar and walked out into the rain. Good riddance, I thought. I have every right to be angry. You see, Audrey and I had met when our campus newspaper sent her to cover a protest rally I'd organized. There had been an instant attraction. We became inseparable pals, and one thing led to another. We practically lived at one another's apartments. And 4 years later, on the verge of graduating, we were still going strong. At least I thought so. One morning as we were walking up the hill to class, I told her how much I loved her, and how I couldn't imagine my life without her. And I asked her to be my wife. Instead, she reacted with shock and told me she needs some time to think it over. She didn't say how much time she would need to mull the question over, but apparently quite a while, because I hadn't seen or spoken to Audrey since that day. Rather than do the right thing and tell me the truth, Audrey skipped town. She even missed the graduation ceremony so she wouldn't have to face me. Who wouldn't be angry? It was painful watching her disappear into the crowd, and I suddenly regretted my haughty attitude. I didn't want it to be another 8 years before I saw her again, before I could at least hear why she'd left me in the lurch like that. Audrey, wait! I ran down the sidewalk and caught up to her. You're right. 8 years is a long time. Can I make you a cup of tea? She hesitated. Sure, I'd like that. One thing, though. Who'd you get pregnant? It's a long story. I smiled and we headed off to search for that cup of tea. Unfortunately, nothing was open. We walked around in the light rain for a while, chatting, catching up. She was asking all the questions and I did most of the talking. I told her who I was working for and described a few of my earthworm-related misadventures in the good old Ukraine. She seemed genuinely curious about what I'd been up to. It felt so good to talk to her that I'm afraid I rambled on and on without asking her any questions about what she'd been doing all that time. Or was that her plan? We headed for my tent. We continued to chat while I prepped the blood sample for testing. It was a little tricky because all the kits I'd purchased were designed for testing urine, but I knew how to get around that. Distracted by my work, I told her my suspicions about the creature. I squeezed a drop of the hormone-rich fluid onto the white litmus paper of the test kit. The paper turned dark red at once. I felt a rush of goose pimples erupt on the back of my neck as I announced, "And he's pregnant!" He is pregnant? Audrey asked, understandably confused. Immediately I began preparations for a more rigorous test to confirm the results of my experiment. I don't get it, she said suspiciously. You just said it's the first of its kind. If that's true, how can it have babies? Doesn't it need a mate? I started thinking out loud. Not necessarily. Keep in mind that this creature is an aberration, a mutant. We don't know how it reproduces. Some species are actually born pregnant, or it might be a hermaphrodite. Or, more likely, it might reproduce asexually. Where's the fun in that? She asked. I decided to ignore that question and continued thinking out loud. I've been asking myself, why? Why would he travel all this way, almost exactly halfway around the world? But now it makes perfect sense. Think of all the different species that migrate great distances in order to bear their young. That's why he came to New York. He's nesting. Nesting? The idea made her uneasy. Yes, and Audrey, do you realize that most species of lizards lay up to a dozen eggs at a time? No, I didn't realize that. Audrey, I've got to get this to the lab, but I'll be right back. I grabbed my sample materials and marched out into the rain. Of course, I needed to verify these astonishing findings before presenting them to Colonel Hicks and the others. I hurried toward the Army's mobile laboratory, an ambulance-sized truck which was parked close by. They had a very sophisticated chemistry lab inside, staffed by an expert crew. While she waited for me to return, Audrey watched the videotape labeled First Sighting, with the footage of the old cook, the decimated village in Panama, and the ruined ship in Jamaica. When she was done, she put it back in the case where she'd found it. A reporter like Heyman wouldn't have thought twice about putting the tape under his jacket and rushing back to the studio with it. But Audrey wasn't the kind of person who would stab an old friend in the back just to get a story. But as she sat there sipping her coffee, waiting for me to return, she remembered how Animal and Lucy had laughed at her in the diner, telling her she wasn't tough enough for the journalism jungle. And something happened to dear, sweet, innocent Audrey Timmins. A change came over her, a mutation that had nothing to do with nuclear contamination. She set down her coffee cup, grabbed the videotape, buried it in the folds of her trench coat, and fled into the rain. Very soon thereafter, I came back and found her missing. I looked around the tent, then went to the door and shouted her name in the downpour. She was nowhere to be found. Once again, she'd suddenly disappeared from my life without explanation, without even leaving a note. And this time I thought to myself, she was probably gone forever. After all those years, one thing had apparently remained the same. Audrey Timmins wasn't interested in spending her time with a boring worm guy.